When Prince was told he was too queer to be a rock star, his response didn't just shake the entire stadium. It redefined what rock and roll could be, who could claim it, and what happened when someone refused to shrink themselves to fit into a genre that thought it owned the definition of cool. The year was 1983. The venue was the Summit in Houston, Texas, 12,000 capacity, sold out. The kind of crowd that came expecting to see a show but got something closer to a religious experience. Prince was midway through his 1,999 tour. That transitional moment between being known and being legendary, between Minneapolis phenomenon and global icon. He stood backstage 30 minutes before showtime when a music journalist cornered him for what was supposed to be a quick pre-show interview. The journalist was named Rick Thompson, 40-something, worked for a major rock magazine, the kind of guy who thought his opinion mattered because he'd been covering music since the 70 seconds, who believed his gatekeeping was protecting rock and roll rather than suffocating it. He looked Prince up and down the purple outfit, the heels, the makeup, the hair, and said with that casual cruelty that comes from believing you're stating obvious truth rather than revealing your own prejudices, "Look, I'm going to level with you. You're talented, no question, but you're too queer to be a real rock star. Rock and roll is about masculinity, rebellion, raw sexuality, not whatever this is." He gestured vaguely at Prince's entire presentation, at the carefully constructed persona that was as much art as any song Prince had ever written. Mick Jagger can get away with androgyny because he's straight. Bowie, too. But you? Everyone knows what you are. And rock fans, real rock fans, they're not going to accept a. Thompson searched for the word, settled on someone like you as one of the greats. You should probably stick to R&B. That's more your lane anyway. Prince looked at him for a long moment, his face completely neutral. Not angry, though. The anger was there, coiled tight in his chest. The rage of hearing the same prejudices he'd faced his entire life, dressed up as professional advice, as industry wisdom, as someone doing him a favor by telling him the truth. "Are you done?" Prince asked quietly. Thompson shrugged. "Just trying to help. This business is brutal, and if you keep presenting yourself like this, you're going to hit a ceiling. That's just reality." Prince smiled then. Not a friendly smile, not even an angry smile, but something else, the smile of someone who'd just been handed ammunition, who'd been given fuel for a fire that was about to consume everything in its path. "Watch the show," Prince said simply. "Then tell me what's too queer for rock and roll." 30 minutes later, Prince walked on stage. The lights went down. 12,000 people screamed. And for the next 2 hours, Prince proceeded to deliver what would later be called one of the most explosive performances of his entire career. A masterclass not just in musicianship, but in dismantling every assumption about what rock and roll was, who it belonged to, what masculinity looked like when it wasn't performed according to rules written by straight white men in the 1,960 seconds. He opened with Little Red Corvette, but not the album version. This was faster, harder, more aggressive. Prince's guitar screaming through the arena, his voice raw and powerful, his body moving in ways that defied every conventional definition of masculine stage presence. He was sensual. He was aggressive. He was vulnerable. He was dominant. He was everything at once, refusing to be reduced to any single category that would make him easier to understand, easier to dismiss, easier to label as too queer for rock. Between songs, while the band vamped, Prince addressed the audience directly. "I was told something tonight," he said, his voice carrying through the arena. Intimate, despite the thousands listening. "I was told I'm too queer to be a rock star." The crowd booed. Loud, angry. 12,000 people rejecting the premise, rejecting the label, rejecting anyone who thought they could define what Prince was or wasn't allowed to be. Prince held up his hand for silence. "No, no. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about what too queer means. Because I think what they're really saying is that I'm too different, too threatening, too unwilling to perform masculinity the way they think it should be performed, too unwilling to be straight, or at least pretend to be straight, so they can feel comfortable celebrating my talent. He walked to the edge of the stage, looking directly at where Thompson sat in the press section, making sure the journalist knew this was for him, about him, because of him. "Here's what I think about being too queer for rock and roll," Prince said. "I think rock and roll has always been queer, has always been about rejecting conformity, about expressing yourself in ways that make mainstream America uncomfortable, about using music and fashion and performance to challenge every assumption about how you're supposed to be." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word, understanding they were witnessing something more than a concert, something that felt like a manifesto, like a declaration of war against everyone who'd tried to put boundaries around what rock could be and who could claim it. "Little Richard wore makeup," Prince continued, "screamed and pounded the piano, and was flamboyant in ways that made white America so uncomfortable they had to give rock and roll to Elvis instead. Make it safe, make it straight, make it acceptable. But Little Richard was there first, creating the template, being too queer for a genre that wouldn't exist without him." Prince picked up his guitar. Jimi Hendrix wore fringe and velvet and played his guitar like he was making love to it. David Bowie created Ziggy Stardust and told everyone that gender was performance and rock and roll was theater. Freddie Mercury fronted the biggest rock band in the world while being exactly who he was, wearing whatever he wanted, loving who he loved. He strummed a chord, let it ring through the arena. And me? I'm 5'2". I wear heels and lace and makeup. I move on stage in ways that some people think are too feminine, too sexual, too queer. And you know what? They're right. I am queer. Not in the way they mean not just about who I love, though that's nobody's business but mine, but queer in the original sense. Strange, odd, different, refusing to conform. Prince launched into Controversy, the title track, the song that asked the questions everyone wanted answered. Is he straight? Is he gay? Does he believe in God? The crowd sang along, screaming the lyrics, understanding that the song was about refusing to answer those questions, about making the ambiguity itself a statement, about understanding that labels were traps designed to make you manageable. Midway through the show, during a guitar solo that went on for 10 minutes, Prince did something he'd never done before on stage. He got down on his knees, arched his back, played the guitar in a position that was explicitly, undeniably sexual, that evoked every stereotype about queerness and femininity and non-masculine performance that people like Thompson used to dismiss him. But there was nothing dismissible about it, because Prince played that guitar like Hendrix, like Clapton, like every guitar god who'd ever been celebrated by rock magazines and inducted into halls of fame. The notes were perfect. The technique was flawless. The emotion was raw. And 12,000 people watched someone be explicitly, proudly, defiantly queer, while also being undeniably, inarguably, one of the greatest rock musicians they'd ever witnessed. When the solo ended, the crowd erupted. Not just applause, but screaming, crying. The kind of response that comes from people witnessing something transformative. Something that changes how they understand the world and themselves and what's possible. Prince stood up slowly, looked directly at the press section again. "Still think I'm too queer for rock and roll?" he asked, into the microphone. The crowd's answer was deafening. 12,000 people screaming, "No!" 12,000 people understanding that they'd just watched someone redefine what rock could be, what masculinity could look like, what it meant to be a star, without conforming to anyone's expectations about how stars were supposed to present themselves. For the encore, Prince played Purple Rain, but not yet the iconic version that would come with the movie and the album. This was still the early version, still rough around the edges, still being refined, but it was already powerful, already transformative, already the kind of song that made people understand why Prince mattered, why his refusal to be categorized wasn't just personal preference, but political statement. As the final notes faded, As the crowd gave him a standing ovation that lasted 15 minutes, Prince spoke one more time. To everyone who's ever been told they're too much, too different, too queer, too anything to be successful, I want you to know something. The people who tell you that are scared, they're scared because you represent a future they can't control. A world where the old rules don't apply, where talent and authenticity matter more than conforming to their narrow definitions of acceptable. He paused. Let that sink in. Rock and roll was created by queer people, by black people, by people who didn't fit into mainstream America's idea of acceptable. And every time someone tells you you're too queer for rock, what they're really saying is that rock has been stolen from the people who created it and needs to be stolen back. Prince raised his guitar. So, I'm not going to stop being queer. I'm not going to stop wearing what I want, moving how I want, presenting myself however feels authentic, because that's what rock and roll actually is. The courage to be yourself, in a world that wants you to be anything else. The crowd went wild. And in the press section, Rick Thompson sat with his notebook, trying to write a review, trying to find words for what he'd just witnessed. The article he eventually published didn't mention the backstage conversation, didn't mention calling Prince too queer, just reviewed the show as one of the most powerful rock performances in recent memory, and said that Prince is redefining what's possible in popular music. But people heard about the conversation anyway. Musicians talked. Crew members talked. The story spread through the industry like wildfire that a journalist had called Prince too queer for rock, and Prince had responded not with defensiveness or apology, but with a performance so devastating, so undeniable, so explicitly, proudly, defiantly queer, while also being unquestionably rock and roll, that it made the criticism look not just wrong, but absurd. The LGBTQ+ community embraced that story, made it legend, because it represented something they'd all lived, being told they were too much, too different, too queer for whatever space they were trying to occupy. And Prince had shown them a response. Don't shrink. Don't apologize. Don't make yourself acceptable. Instead, be so undeniably excellent, so absolutely authentic, so proud of exactly who you are, that anyone who tries to diminish you ends up diminishing themselves. Young queer kids in the 80 seconds. Kids growing up during AIDS crisis, during moral panic about homosexuality, during a time when being queer could get you fired, evicted, attacked, killed. They held on to that story, held on to the image of Prince on his knees, arching his back, playing guitar in a way that was explicitly queer and explicitly rock and roll, proving that those categories weren't mutually exclusive, that you could be both, that you could be everything. Years later, when rock magazines started making their lists of greatest guitarists, greatest performers, greatest artists, Prince was always near the top. The same magazines that had published writers like Thompson, that had gate-kept rock and roll as a straight masculine space, now had to acknowledge that one of rock's greatest practitioners had been someone they'd dismissed as too queer, and Prince never let them forget it. In interviews, when asked about his influence, about his legacy, about what he wanted to be remembered for, he'd often say some version of the same thing. I want people to know that you don't have to choose between being yourself and being successful. That authenticity isn't a barrier to excellence, it's the foundation of it. That the people who tell you you're too different, too queer, too anything, are really just scared of a world where they don't get to define what's acceptable anymore. Rick Thompson eventually tried to interview Prince again, years later, after Purple Rain had made Prince undeniable even to the most skeptical critics. Prince agreed to the interview but started it by saying, "So, am I still too queer for rock and roll? Or did rock and roll expand enough to include people like me? Or, and I think this is the real answer, was I always rock and roll and you just couldn't see it because you were looking for something that looked like you?" Thompson apologized, said he'd been wrong, said that watching Prince's career had taught him that his definitions of rock had been too narrow, too rooted in conventions that had more to do with protecting straight white masculine dominance than with celebrating the actual spirit of rock and roll, which was, as Prince had said, about rebellion, authenticity, refusing to conform. "I appreciate that," Prince said, "but I didn't change. I didn't become less queer or more acceptable or more rock and roll. I stayed exactly who I was. What changed was that I got so successful, so undeniable, that people like you had no choice but to admit I belonged in the conversation. That's not growth. That's just capitulation." The interview was never published. Thompson said Prince had been difficult, which everyone understood meant Prince had refused to let Thompson rewrite history, refused to let him pretend that the gatekeeping hadn't happened, that the too queer comment hadn't revealed everything about who got to define rock and roll and who got dismissed. But the story lived on, got passed down through generations of musicians who didn't fit conventional definitions, through queer artists who faced the same gatekeeping, the same dismissal, the same insistence that they needed to be less themselves to be successful. And they all remembered. Prince refused. Prince stayed exactly who he was. Prince made them expand their definitions instead of shrinking himself to fit their boxes. When Prince died in 2016, the tributes from the LGBTQ+ community were profound. Not because Prince had ever definitively identified as queer, he hadn't maintained that ambiguity about his sexuality his entire life, but because he'd been an ally when it mattered, had refused to distance himself from queerness, had made queerness central to his artistry, his presentation, his revolutionary impact on what rock and roll could be and who could claim it. One tribute came from a trans musician named Alex, who wrote, "Prince taught me that too queer is just code for threatening to people who want to maintain control over cultural spaces. That being told you don't belong isn't a verdict, it's an LFI, invitation to prove them wrong, not by changing yourself, but by being so excellent, so authentic, so undeniably yourself that they have no choice but to acknowledge you." Prince was too queer for rock and roll. And that's exactly why rock and roll needed him. That's the legacy of that night in Houston. That's what 12,000 people screaming meant. Not just appreciation for a great show, though it was a great show, but recognition that they'd witnessed someone refuse to be made smaller, refuse to choose between authenticity and success, refuse to let anyone else define what they could or couldn't be. Too queer for rock and roll. Prince heard that criticism and turned it into a mission statement, became so queer, so unapologetically himself, so explicitly challenging to conventional definitions of masculinity and rock and acceptable presentation that he didn't just succeed despite being too queer, he succeeded because of it, because his queerness was what made him revolutionary, what made him matter, what made 12,000 people scream and millions more understand that the future of rock belonged to people who refused to play by the old rules. The journalist thought he was protecting rock and roll. Prince showed him he was actually limiting it, keeping it small, keeping it safe, keeping it straight and masculine and boring. And when 12,000 people screamed their approval, when they validated Prince's refusal to conform, they weren't just supporting one artist. They were declaring that rock and roll belonged to everyone brave enough to claim it. That queer wasn't too anything. That different was the whole point. That's not just a response to criticism. That's revolution. That's what happens when someone refuses to accept the labels meant to diminish them and instead makes those labels irrelevant through sheer, undeniable excellence. Too queer for rock and roll. Prince heard it, rejected it, redefined it, made 12,000 people scream in agreement that the only thing too small was the critic's imagination.